D'accord, retournez-vous. Point.
D'accord.
On ne va pas jouer à ce jeu avec vous.
Non, rien. Non, c'est bon.
Vous n'écoutez pas. Vous n'écoutez pas mes instructions.
J'écoute vos instructions.
Non, vous n'écoutez pas. Vous n'écoutez pas.
Oui, je le fais. Vous êtes délicat.
Je suis. Comment?
Arrêtez de bouger.
The first moments after the collision establish a familiar but fragile order. Emergency lights cut through traffic, lanes close, and officers move with practiced efficiency, attempting to convert chaos into structure. At this stage, the interaction remains procedural. Questions are asked. Vehicles are identified. The scene is still fluid, but the authority dynamic is not yet fixed. What matters most in these early minutes is that no irreversible conclusions have been reached. Everything remains provisional facts unverified, fault undetermined, outcomes undecided. The woman at the center of the incident appears disoriented, struggling to articulate what happened. Her account is repetitive and uncertain, not because she is defiant, but because she is trying to reconcile shock with explanation. The officers do not immediately challenge her narrative. Instead, they begin the mechanical process of sorting people and risks. Traffic control, EMS inquiries, and separation of involved parties are standard. At this point, nothing in the interaction requires escalation. This is still a traffic collision, not a criminal confrontation. However, even in these early exchanges, subtle indicators begin to accumulate. The woman's speech pattern is circular. Her attention drifts. She fixates on details that do not advance clarity. These observations, though minor on their own, begin to shape the officer's internal assessments. Law enforcement training emphasizes pattern recognition, identifying inconsistencies, behaviors or impairments that may not rise to probable cause but justify closer scrutiny. Importantly, this stage demands restraint. Observations are not conclusions. They are inputs, not verdicts. The situation changes when third-party statements enter the scene. Another driver reports that the woman had been swerving and appeared intoxicated prior to the collision. This information, while not independently verified, carries weight. Officers are allowed to consider witness statements when forming reasonable suspicion, but those statements do not replace investigation. They must be contextualized, corroborated, and tested against observable facts. The danger lies in allowing an unverified claim to harden prematurely into an assumption. From here, the narrative begins to tilt. The woman is asked for identification. She complies. She is directed where to stand. She follows instructions, though not smoothly. Her confusion is interpreted less as shock and more as resistance. This is the first critical shift, not in behavior, but in perception. Once an officer begins to interpret ambiguity as non-compliance, the range of acceptable responses narrows rapidly. The issuance of a citation for careless driving becomes a flashpoint. The woman challenges it, not with profanity or threats, but with procedural objections. She questions whether an investigation has been completed. She references cameras. She insists she was stopped. These are not legally irrelevant points. In fact, they mirror the same standards officers themselves rely upon: evidence, verification, and due process. But tone and timing matter. In roadside encounters, questions are often perceived not as requests for clarification, but as challenges to authority. At this juncture, the interaction ceases to be purely about the crash. It becomes a negotiation over control. The officer seeks compliance with the citation process. The woman seeks acknowledgement of her account and assurance that she is not being punished prematurely. Neither side fully yields. The tension remains verbal, but the foundation for escalation is laid. When the officer instructs her to stop yelling, a decisive framing occurs. Labeling behavior as aggressive changes how all subsequent actions are justified. From that point forward, officer responses are no longer measured against a neutral baseline, but against a perceived threat level. The woman denies yelling, insists she is in pain, and repeatedly emphasizes that she does not want to be seen as aggressive. Ironically, this insistence only reinforces the officer's perception that the interaction is deteriorating. This moment reveals a critical failure in de-escalation. Pain, emotional distress, and fear are not inherently threatening, but without deliberate effort to separate those factors from intentional defiance, officers may treat them as equivalent. Once that happens, procedural patience erodes. The introduction of Miranda rights marks a formal transition. The encounter is no longer administrative, it is criminal. This shift carries enormous psychological weight. For the woman, it confirms that she is now being treated as a suspect rather than a participant in an investigation. For the officer, it legitimizes a more directive posture. Questions are no longer collaborative, they are interrogative. The officer states explicitly that a DUI investigation is underway. This declaration reframes all prior behavior retroactively. Observations that were once neutral now become indicators. Statements that were once explanatory become admissions. The woman acknowledges having consumed alcohol at a birthday dinner. She quantifies it as 2 or 3 shots. This admission alone does not establish impairment, but it satisfies a threshold that allows the officer to proceed with field sobriety testing. Here, the power imbalance becomes unmistakable. Field sobriety tests are presented as an opportunity to demonstrate fitness to drive, yet refusal carries implicit consequences. The woman asks what the tests would do for her. It is a rational question, rooted in self-preservation. The officer responds with the necessity of determining her ability to operate a vehicle, even as she explains she has already arranged alternative transportation. This distinction matters. DUI investigations are not solely about future driving risk, they are about past conduct. The officer is correct procedurally, but the explanation does not address the woman's underlying fear that the outcome is predetermined. Her initial refusal is tentative. It is not defiant, it is uncertain. When the officer instructs her to place her belongings on the hood and turn around, the interaction crosses another threshold. Physical control measures are introduced before the investigative process is complete. Although officers may detain individuals during DUI investigations, the manner and timing of physical commands significantly influence how the encounter unfolds. The woman's compliance becomes inconsistent, not because she is resisting, but because she is overwhelmed. She speaks rapidly, attempts to reason aloud, references her education in criminal justice, and tries to narrate her own understanding of the law. None of this is effective. In fact, it accelerates the breakdown. Officers do not interpret legal commentary from suspects as informed participation, they interpret it as argumentative. When she reverses her decision and agrees to perform field sobriety tests, the moment for de-escalation briefly reappears. Agreement could have reset the tone. Instead, the exchange becomes entangled in confusion over consent, coercion, and timing. The officer seeks a clear affirmation that she is participating freely. She simultaneously agrees and predicts failure, expressing fatalism rather than resistance. This ambivalence frustrates the officer, who now views the interaction as a game rather than a dialogue. Her insistence on having a witness present is dismissed. Legally, she has no right to a witness during field sobriety tests. Practically, however, her request reflects distrust, not obstruction. The refusal to acknowledge that fear further entrenches the adversarial posture. As instructions begin, the woman continues to speak. She seeks reassurance that the process is being recorded. She requests responsible oversight. These interruptions, though non-violent, are framed as non-compliance. The officer declares that they are not going to play this game, signaling a complete collapse of patience. At this point, the outcome is no longer uncertain. The encounter has shifted from investigation to enforcement. The physical handling that follows is justified by the officers as a response to belligerence. Yet the bodycam reveals a more complex reality. The woman repeatedly asks what she has done wrong. She questions the accusation of belligerence. She attempts to adjust her position due to wrist pain. Each movement is interpreted as resistance. Each attempt to explain is treated as defiance. This is the critical juncture highlighted in the opening hook. The moment when verbal confusion becomes physical force is not caused by a single act, but by accumulated misinterpretations. The officers believe they are controlling a non-compliant subject. The woman believes she is being punished for not understanding how to comply correctly. Both perspectives coexist, but only one holds institutional power. Once physical control is established, the narrative is effectively closed. Subsequent explanations no longer matter. The woman's statements that she is not resisting are rendered irrelevant by the officer's internal classification of her behavior. Pain responses are treated as movement. Movement is treated as resistance. Resistance justifies escalation. This sequence illustrates how lawful authority can drift into misuse without malicious intent. No officer explicitly announces an intention to punish or dominate. Instead, a series of small decisions each defensible in isolation compound into an outcome that feels disproportionate and inevitable. The system does not require bad actors to produce harmful results. It requires only rigidity, impatience, and an inability to recalibrate once a narrative has formed. By the end of this first phase, the woman is no longer a driver involved in a crash. She is a subject being controlled. The distinction is not semantic, it defines everything that follows. The remaining events will unfold within a framework that has already assumed guilt, resistance, and risk. Reversal is no longer possible, not because the law demands it, but because the momentum of authority has taken over. Once physical control is initiated, the encounter enters a phase where interpretation replaces inquiry. From this point forward, every action by the woman is filtered through a presumption of non-compliance, and every officer response is justified as necessary control. This is the most dangerous stage of any police-citizen interaction, not because violence is inevitable, but because reassessment effectively stops. The system locks into motion. The officer's language begins to change subtly but decisively. Instructions become commands. Commands become ultimatums. The margin for misunderstanding disappears. In theory, lawful orders are meant to create clarity. In practice, when a subject is already confused, distressed, or physically uncomfortable, clarity does not emerge. Instead, the pace accelerates faster than the subject can cognitively or physically adapt. The woman repeatedly states that she is listening. This assertion is not rhetorical, it is defensive. She is attempting to anchor herself to compliance, to reassure the officers and herself that she is not intentionally defying them. But compliance in law enforcement encounters is not measured by intent, it is measured by outcome. If an officer issues an instruction and the subject's body does not immediately conform, the system interprets that delay as resistance, regardless of the reason. Here, the woman's movements are small, reactive, and explanatory. She shifts her wrists because of pain. She adjusts her posture. She tries to speak while moving. None of these actions would be remarkable in a non-police context. In this context, however, movement itself becomes evidence. The officers articulate that she is not listening, even as she verbally acknowledges instructions. This contradiction reveals the core disconnect. Listening is no longer defined as hearing or understanding, but as silent, immediate physical submission. When the officers state that they are not going to play this game, the phrase carries institutional weight. It signals that dialogue has ended. From this point on, the officers are no longer attempting to gain cooperation, they are enforcing compliance. That distinction matters because enforcement tolerates far less ambiguity. Pain explanations become irrelevant. Confusion becomes obstruction. Emotional expression becomes belligerence. The woman asks what she has done to be labeled belligerent. This is not a challenge, it is a request for definition. She is attempting to understand the standard she has allegedly violated so that she can correct her behavior. The officers do not provide a concrete answer. Instead, they reference her way of acting. This vagueness is critical. When standards are undefined, compliance becomes impossible. The subject cannot adjust behavior to meet expectations that are not clearly articulated. At this stage, the officer's internal justification relies heavily on tone rather than action. Raised voice, repeated speech, emotional urgency, these are interpreted as aggression, despite the absence of threats or violence. The woman does not strike, flee, or attempt to escape. Yet her emotional intensity is treated as equivalent to physical resistance. This equivalence is not mandated by law, it is a discretionary judgment shaped by training culture and stress response. The physical positioning exacerbates the problem. The woman is placed in a posture that causes discomfort. She communicates that her wrist hurts. Pain responses are involuntary. When pain occurs, the body instinctively seeks relief. The officers interpret that instinct as resistance. This is a classic escalation loop. Discomfort causes movement. Movement is labeled resistance. Resistance justifies more force, which causes more discomfort. At no point does an officer pause the process to reassess. There is no reset, no recalibration. The assumption that she is resisting hardens with each second. This is not because officers are incapable of reassessment, but because institutional momentum discourages it. Backing off after initiating physical control can be perceived as loss of authority or uncertainty. The system rewards decisiveness, even when decisiveness is misplaced. The woman repeatedly states that she is not trying to resist. These statements do not alter the officer's actions because intent no longer matters. In enforcement mode, outcomes override explanations. The officers focus on controlling limbs, positioning the body, and completing the arrest process. Communication becomes one-directional. Commands are issued without confirmation of comprehension. This phase illustrates a fundamental truth about police encounters. Escalation does not require malice. It requires only a mismatch between expectation and capacity. The officers expect immediate, silent compliance. The woman is emotionally overwhelmed, physically uncomfortable, and cognitively overloaded. Those conditions make immediate compliance unlikely, but the system does not account for that disparity. As she is moved toward the vehicle, the physical imbalance becomes more pronounced. She struggles to sit in a way that does not exacerbate wrist pain. The officers interpret her shifting as refusal to comply. Each attempt to explain is met with "stop moving." The contradiction is stark. She is instructed to stop moving while being physically maneuvered into a position that causes pain. The expectation is that she endure discomfort silently. Anything less is resistance. The body cam captures repeated assurances from the woman that she is not being disrespectful or rude. These assurances reflect her understanding that demeanor has become the central issue. She is attempting to correct the perceived problem. But demeanor-based enforcement is inherently subjective. Once officers decide that a subject's demeanor is unacceptable, there is no objective benchmark for improvement. The officer's language emphasizes control over care. Statements like "stop moving" and "lean back" dominate. There is no acknowledgement of pain beyond dismissal. The woman's claim that her arm hurts is treated as an inconvenience rather than a factor requiring adjustment. This does not necessarily violate policy, but it demonstrates how quickly procedural goals can eclipse human considerations. The moment when an officer states that the subject attempted to slip her cuffs to the front crystallizes the narrative. This claim reframes prior movements as intentional manipulation rather than discomfort. Once such a characterization is verbalized on camera, it becomes part of the official record. From that point forward, all prior ambiguity is resolved in favor of culpability. Importantly, this characterization occurs after force has already been applied. The narrative is retroactive. Actions that were previously explained as attempts to relieve pain are reclassified as escape attempts. This retroactive framing is a powerful institutional tool. It justifies prior force and preempts future scrutiny. The woman continues to ask for assistance and clarification. She requests another officer. She states that she is trying to comply. These requests are ignored or overridden. At this stage, the officers are no longer engaging with her as a person seeking understanding. They are managing a problem to be completed. The system's failure here is not rooted in a single unlawful act. It is rooted in an accumulation of discretionary decisions that all lean in the same direction. Each decision narrows options. Each narrowing makes reversal less likely. By the time the woman is fully restrained and placed in the vehicle, the possibility of de-escalation has vanished entirely. What is striking is how little actual criminal behavior is required to reach this outcome. The initial offense is a traffic collision. The secondary investigation is DUI, based on admitted alcohol consumption and subjective observations. There is no evidence at this stage of violent intent, flight risk, or threat to officers. Yet the encounter culminates in force, restraint, and additional charges. This progression highlights a structural issue within law enforcement encounters: the conflation of control with safety. Officers are trained to prioritize control to prevent worst-case scenarios. While this logic has merit in genuinely dangerous situations, its application in low-threat contexts can produce unnecessary harm. Control becomes the default response to uncertainty, rather than one option among many. The woman's repeated invocation of her criminal justice education underscores another dynamic. Institutional authority does not tolerate perceived peer challenges in the field. While her references may have been ill-timed and ineffective, they reflect an attempt to assert procedural understanding. Instead of being treated as engagement, they are interpreted as arrogance or defiance. This interpretation further erodes patience. By the end of this phase, the encounter has fully transitioned from investigation to punishment, not legally perhaps, but functionally. The woman is no longer being evaluated, she is being processed. Her voice no longer influences outcomes. The officer's focus shifts to documentation, transport, and charge articulation. This is the point of no return. Everything that follows the chemical testing, the formal charges, the narrative in reports will be shaped by the framing established during this physical escalation. The system will interpret events through the lens of resistance and belligerence because that lens has already been applied. The tragedy of this stage is not that officers acted within their authority. It is that authority was applied without proportionality or recalibration. The law allows discretion precisely so that officers can adjust responses to circumstances. When discretion is abandoned in favor of rigidity, lawful authority drifts toward misuse. What remains is not an isolated incident, but a pattern. A pattern in which confusion becomes defiance, pain becomes resistance, and emotional distress becomes justification for force. This pattern persists not because it is hidden, but because it is normalized. Bodycam footage captures it clearly, yet the system continues to reproduce it. As the woman is secured, the narrative is effectively sealed. The next phase will no longer concern how the situation escalated, but how it is recorded, charged, and justified after the fact. The focus shifts from behavior to paperwork, from interaction to outcome. The institutional machinery moves forward, largely indifferent to the human cost incurred along the way. By the time the encounter reaches its final stage, the outcome is no longer shaped by interaction but by documentation. The physical struggle has ended, the subject is restrained, and the officer's focus turns inward to reports, classifications, and charges. This is where the encounter is no longer lived but recorded, and the way it is recorded determines how it will be understood by supervisors, prosecutors, judges, and the public. What matters now is not what the woman intended, believed, or attempted to explain, but how her actions are translated into official language. The narrative crystallizes around key phrases: belligerent, non-compliant, resisting, attempted to slip cuffs. These descriptors are not neutral. They are conclusions. Once entered into a report, they become facts unless actively challenged. Bodycam footage may exist, but reports guide interpretation. Video is reviewed through the lens of the written account, not the other way around. This is where institutional power exerts its quietest, most consequential force. The officer's account does not need to be malicious to be decisive. It only needs to be coherent. Ambiguity favors authority. Conflicting interpretations are resolved by credibility, and credibility is structurally weighted toward law enforcement. The woman's earlier confusion, pain, and emotional distress will not appear as such in the final narrative. They will be subsumed into behavioral labels that justify the outcome. The charges reflect this transformation. What began as a traffic collision now includes driving under the influence at a specified level, damage to property, and possession-related offenses. Each charge is legally distinct, yet they are interconnected through the same encounter. The escalation that occurred during the stop does not merely affect how the arrest unfolded, it influences the scope of criminal liability. The DUI charge rests on a combination of admitted alcohol consumption, officer observations, and the woman's performance or lack thereof during the field sobriety process. But the field sobriety tests never truly occurred in a clean, controlled manner. The process collapsed under confusion, coercion fears, and escalating tension. Yet the failure of the process does not negate its use as justification. The absence of compliance becomes evidence itself. The possession charges introduce another layer. Items discovered during a custodial search are treated as independent offenses, legally detached from the conduct that led to the search. In practice, however, they are inseparable from the escalation. Had the encounter de-escalated earlier, had alternative transportation been accepted, had the sobriety testing proceeded calmly, had physical restraint been avoided, the search may never have occurred. The system does not account for this causal chain. It treats each charge as isolated, even when they are functionally cumulative. The refusal-related charge underscores the same dynamic. Willful refusal is not merely a legal designation, it is a narrative conclusion about intent. It assumes clarity where there was confusion, deliberateness where there was distress. The woman's repeated attempts to understand the process, to ask questions, to clarify consequences, these do not translate into the legal definition of refusal. What translates is the officer's perception that she did not comply cleanly or promptly. This is how escalation compounds consequences. Each stage of enforcement creates conditions for additional charges, each justified by the last. The system does not reset when circumstances change. It builds. By the end, the legal exposure far exceeds the initial conduct that brought officers to the scene. What is most striking is how invisible this compounding effect becomes once formal charges are filed. Court records will not reflect the early uncertainty, the miscommunication, or the missed opportunities for de-escalation. They will reflect outcomes. Judges and prosecutors will see a list of charges, not a sequence of decisions. The system privileges endpoints over processes. The woman's repeated efforts to assert her rights, her education, and her understanding of the law ultimately work against her. In the courtroom, these assertions may be reframed as indicators of consciousness of guilt or adversarial attitude. The same words that she believed might protect her are repurposed to justify the officer's interpretation of her demeanor. This inversion highlights a profound asymmetry. Citizens are encouraged to know their rights, yet exercising that knowledge during an encounter often escalates risk. The system tolerates silence far more readily than articulation. Compliance is safest when it is wordless. Once a subject speaks, tone and timing become liabilities. The bodycam footage captures all of this, yet footage alone does not ensure accountability. Review processes are typically conducted by the same institutions that train, supervise, and evaluate the officers involved. This creates an inherent conflict not necessarily of intent, but of perspective. Reviewers are trained to see what officers are trained to see: threat potential, non-compliance cues, and justification for force. They are less trained to identify missed opportunities for de-escalation or cognitive overload in civilians. In internal reviews, the question is, rarely could this have gone differently. It is, were policy thresholds met? This is a narrow inquiry. Policy compliance does not equal optimal policing. An encounter can meet minimum standards and still represent a systemic failure. The woman's pain complaints, for example, may be noted but dismissed as incidental. The officer's commands may be deemed lawful. The physical restraint may be justified under use of force guidelines. Each individual action can be defended. The cumulative effect, however, remains unexamined. This fragmentation is how patterns persist. No single decision triggers corrective action. Each is insulated by the last. Accountability systems struggle to address this because they are designed to identify violations, not dysfunctions. Dysfunction thrives in the space between policy boxes. Public reaction to such footage often polarizes quickly. Some viewers focus on the woman's behavior, her talking, her agitation, her refusal to remain silent. Others focus on the officer's escalation and dismissiveness. Both perspectives miss the deeper issue. The problem is not individual temperament. It is structural misalignment between authority and human variability. Most civilians do not know how to perform compliance in a way that law enforcement expects under stress. They do not understand that explanations can be interpreted as resistance, that movement can be construed as defiance, that emotional expression can trigger escalation. These expectations are rarely articulated, yet they are enforced rigidly. Law enforcement training emphasizes command presence and control, often at the expense of adaptive communication. Officers are taught to issue clear commands, but not always to recognize when commands themselves are contributing to confusion. When communication fails, force becomes the fallback not because it is desired, but because it is reliable. The cost of this reliability is trust. Each encounter like this reinforces public perception that compliance is less about safety and more about submission. That perception erodes legitimacy, especially in communities already skeptical of police authority. The system then responds to that skepticism with increased control measures, creating a feedback loop that benefits no one. For the woman, the consequences extend far beyond the roadside. Legal fees, court appearances, potential license suspension, and lasting records follow. Even if charges are reduced or dismissed, the process itself is punitive. Time, money, and emotional strain are extracted regardless of outcome. This is not an aberration, it is a feature of the system's design. The officers, meanwhile, move on to the next call. The encounter becomes one report among many. There is no malice in this detachment, it is occupational necessity. Yet this very necessity allows patterns to continue unchallenged. When outcomes are normalized, reflection becomes optional. The bodycam, often hailed as a tool for transparency, captures truth without interpretation. Interpretation remains human, institutional, and biased by design. Cameras do not enforce accountability. They merely provide raw material. What matters is how that material is used. This case illustrates how authority, once asserted, resists reversal. Early decisions shape later ones. Labels harden. Escalation justifies itself. The law provides broad discretion, but discretion without humility becomes rigidity. Rigidity produces harm not through excess, but through inflexibility. The lesson here is not about guilt or innocence. It is about process integrity. A system that cannot slow down, reassess, or absorb human variability without escalating force is a system that will continue to produce these outcomes regardless of individual intentions. In the end, the footage does not show a singular moment of misconduct. It shows something more troubling: a routine failure, a failure of communication, of proportionality, of institutional self-correction. These failures are harder to confront because they are not dramatic. They are procedural. They happen quietly, repeatedly, and lawfully, and that is precisely why they matter.